I am co-host Amy Kluber, Managing Editor of Government CIO Media and Research.
And I'm co-host Amanda Ziede, Senior Reporter with Government CIO Media and Research.
Welcome to Season 2.
Hello and welcome to GovCast. Today I'm joined by Charles Worthington, the Chief Technology Officer of the Department of Veteran Affairs. Thank you so much for joining us today, Charles.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so I want to start by asking you a bit about your background. When did you join government? How long have you been in a government position?
I joined in 2013 as a part of the Presidential Innovation Fellows program. I was in the second class of fellows in that program, which was started up, I guess, about a year before I joined.
All right. What were you doing before?
So right before that, I was doing a mix of consulting for companies doing product design and software development work, and also working on my own product. I had a little startup idea at the time, and was sort of working on that stuff.
So something I've realized out of all these interviews in GovCast is people generally did not go to school for anything technology related, but somehow end up in these awesome IT related positions in government. So did you go to school for anything tech related?
No, I majored in social studies, which was probably a class you took in like 8th grade. But that was my major. And my focus was on international relations and environmental policy, actually. But I'd always been really interested in technology, and sort of on the side took classes in that. Actually did a really cool class. Probably the most technical class I wound up taking in college was an art class. It was interactive art, and so wound up programming this interactive art display. So it was always an interest of mine, and I think that came from growing up in a house where computers were everywhere. My mom was a software engineer, and
wow.
So yeah.
That's cool. So you had all of that. You were exposed to that pretty young then.
Yeah.
Early on
It's kind of funny. My mom is a software engineer who wound up starting her own software consulting, small software consulting business in Minneapolis. And my dad worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So
interesting.
It's kind of strange how it's kind of worked out that I'm now like this weird hybrid of both
right.
of them.
Did you ever work with her in that company? Is that where you got?
No, I mean, helping them just do random tasks at the office. She would take us there sometimes on the weekends while she was working. We'd like stuff envelopes, or, back in those days, it was mailing floppy disks around and CDs. And so, but just was exposed to technology from a young age. I remember when we got our first Mac, playing all these different games on the Mac and the compacts. And so, seeing that from an early age, I think gave me a lot of interest in it.
So you left with a social studies degree from Harvard, which is an all right school. How did you from there get into this field?
My first job out of college was doing strategy consulting for technology and telecom companies.
Okay.
So sort of Verizon, Comcast, Microsoft, those types of companies. And a lot of strategy and management consulting winds up being sort of thinking a lot about these new and cool emerging technologies and how they're going to impact and, disrupt a lot of these bigger established companies. And so after doing that for about 5 years, it got to be where I was a little bit sick of kind of doing analyses and writing cool slides about these disruptive sounding product ideas, and wanted to actually work on the products themselves. Mm-hmm. So I left strategy consulting and sort of went back to my passion, which had been kind of building stuff, and kind of relearned the modern way of building web applications, web and mobile applications, and spent a couple of years doing that. And meanwhile, my family, we moved to DC because my wife got a job out here. So we had moved to DC, and I heard about this Innovation Fellows program and figured, I'm in DC why not give this a try? And so never expected that I would still be in government now, I guess 6 years later, but it was a good time to join the government as a technologist because there was so much interest in changing the way the government buys and builds technology at that time.
Yeah, so that was kind of your call to government, was coming to DC. So it wasn't the opposite. We tend to hear people came to DC for a government job.
Yeah, that's right. I was here, and most of my clients were back on the West Coast. Mm-hmm. We had moved from the Bay Area most directly, and I was here anyway, so had started to get into the tech startup scene here, and I had started to work on my own product, but heard about this program, so applied for it, and then heard that I had gotten an offer to join, and decided, for a year that would be a cool thing to do. And so
for a year,
yeah, and here I am.
How have you seen technology and government evolve for those 6 years?
Oh, that's interesting.
So far.
So I think the biggest thing that has changed is that the acceptance of doing things in the sort of modern way of building technology products has really risen dramatically. It used to be that, when you talked about hosting things in the cloud or using a software as a service product or doing continuous integration, continuous deployment, you were kind of looked at like, what are you talking about? That's a bad idea. It's not secure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I feel like you're not hearing those same arguments anymore. Now the question is all about, yes, that's how we need to do it. How do we do it? How can we train our people to do it? How can we do acquisition smarter to do it? So I think just, at first there was a lot of resistance to some of the ideas that we talked about in the digital services playbook. And now there's doesn't seem to be resistance. It's more like everyone's trying to figure out how can we actually adapt to use these techniques.
And kind of going back a little bit, did you face any sort of cultural shifts or challenges when you made the switch from industry to government, especially in the tech field? Because I'm sure tech was a little bit more advanced in the private sector.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think any big organization has a lot of similar challenges. Any big organization has bureaucracy, which is true of government or private sector. But I think just the sheer size of government is overwhelming, and it can be challenging to figure out how to make an impact in a place so big. And so I think that's something that I have learned how to get better at, and I think just as a civic tech movement, we've all kind of learned to get more effective at. But certainly that was one of the biggest challenges, stepping in as an innovation fellow into the Department of Energy, which is where my assignment was.
Oh, wow.
Trying to just kind of make sense of this place, and it's such a big place, and trying to figure out, what's one thing that I can do for a year that will make a difference here can be challenging. And
from then, did you go from being an innovation fellow to helping build USDS?
Yeah, that's right. So it was about halfway through my fellowship when the healthcare.gov site launched and initially failed and then was rescued by the team that kind of went in and tried to stand the service back up. And coming back from the rescue effort, basically there was a lot of momentum around this idea that the government should have teams like the team that fixed healthcare.gov in more places in the government. So it gave momentum to ideas that people like Jen Palka and Todd Park had been pushing even before healthcare.gov. But when they came back, basically the ask was, how do we prevent the next healthcare.gov? How do we make it so that there are teams like this available on more of the government's most important projects? And so I moved over to Todd Park's office in the CTO's office at the White House to help Jen start up the U.S. Digital Service. So I was there for about 6 months, sort of working with a bunch of people to help start the U.S. Digital Service, and then moved over to work for the Digital Service once we got it up off the ground in 2014.
Wow, what was that like, the early days of USDS?
Well, it was, definitely we knew we had this proof point that this model of sending multidisciplinary technical teams into big, important problems could have a big difference. And so we sort of had a template, which was the healthcare.gov rescue effort. And I guess the first thing we had to figure out is would anyone even join this? We had this idea that, we maybe would hire 10 people, and could we even convince 10 technologists to come do this thing? That was the hardest part at first, especially, as we were just standing it up and there really wasn't a team yet. But we had a really fantastic group of people in the White House that were working on that.
Did you work with Marcy Jacobs? Yeah,
so Marcy joined the digital service, I'd have to look up the exact year, but maybe a year or two after we started it up. So I remember when Marcy we were trying to recruit Marcy. So I remember her walking around our offices trying to get a feel for, what was this digital service thing. And I think a lot of people had that reaction when they first walked in the doors. It has this weird feel of being like a startup. Like you walk in the doors and you recognize that there's cool stuff all over the walls and people sitting on couches and laptops all over the place, but it's also in this strange government building. So people can immediately tell that something's different.
Yeah, we interviewed her on GovCast a few episodes ago, and she talked about her initial meeting with Todd Park and breakfast at the White House when she was joining. So it's just fun to draw those connections.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, one of the interesting things in my journey is that I wound up actually for about a year working basically exclusively on hiring, which I had never done any sort of hiring activity before, but it became pretty clear pretty early in the digital service that our initial expectations that it would be hard to get 10 people were wrong, and that actually there was a lot of demand in the tech industry for public service opportunities that would give them a lot of impact. And so our challenge suddenly went from, can we convince anyone to join, to suddenly, there's 3,000 applications and we've got to figure out how to build a hiring process from scratch that will result in really great people joining. And we know that we're competing against, Google and Facebook and Apple that have not only, much higher compensation, but also can make hiring decisions really, really quickly. So one of the things I worked on was helping build the process that would get candidates through the door quickly in a way that would allow them to feel comfortable that they could take this big risk to join this startup in government. So that was a fun time. I probably, one of the most impactful things I've done is having those conversations with people like Marcy and trying to convince them to take this leap. And we were ultimately successful in bringing in over 200 people in those first couple of years of the digital service, which I'm really proud of.
Yeah, there must be a way to help other agencies, or I'm sure maybe you use these practices now, attract this kind of IT talent, because it's still hiring the proper skilled IT talent in government is still a challenge right now. So
absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of it is kind of common sense. If you look at a private sector company, a lot of energy every day is spent on recruiting and hiring. And so I think, there's a couple things that we've proved to be successful that I think are broadly applicable. One is doing active recruiting. So you can't just post a job announcement and hope that the right people are going to apply. You need to convince them to apply. And I think that's true probably of every job series, but that's especially true for technology, where it's a very competitive market. So going to places where the people you want to apply are and telling them about your job and why it's exciting and why they might want to consider it, that's an important first step. And you want to make sure that you get them to actually apply, because those people are not just surfing USA Jobs hoping to see a post that's interesting to them. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is really just the time. I think people often wind up submitting an application and then it's kind of like a black box where you just wait for months and you maybe never hear anything. And what we found in the digital service was that even if all you did was every week or 2 weeks, you checked in with them and said, hey, just wanted to let you know we've got your application. We're still working on it. No news yet, but don't worry. We haven't forgotten about you. Even just that every 2 weeks was enough to keep people feeling like, this isn't just a faceless black hole and who knows. It gave them a sense that there was somebody on the other end of it. So those two things alone, just telling people to apply to good jobs, and then once they do apply, telling them, even if it's going to take another 3 months, just telling them that and staying in touch with them. Those are pretty simple things that I think most hiring managers could do.
That's so important. I wanted to jump back really quick and ask if there was anything really memorable, crazy, exciting that you worked on at DOE when you were an innovation fellow that you can talk about?
Yeah. I'm trying to think of like a good story.
Yeah.
The project that I was working on there was basically helping implement the open data policy at Department of Energy. So making it easier for outside entities to get access to the data and services that DOE had created. And so we tried a variety of techniques, publishing new APIs, publishing descriptions of the data sets, and then we even ran a hackathon. So I think, convincing the people that were in charge of protecting the nuclear weapons that we were going to do a thing called a hackathon was probably a little bit, I think we actually wound up calling it like a data challenge instead of a hackathon. So maybe they won that battle.
That's funny. Was it citizen facing? Anyone was allowed to?
Yeah. And, the goal was basically try to, Department of Energy and its labs had created a lot of really interesting data sets, especially around energy efficiency. One example was there's a model that will basically kind of predict how effective a solar panel would be given where you live on the globe and also the angle of the roof and all these other factors. And so that model is, this crazy model that's been built in the national lab. But to actually make that useful, we needed to find ways to expose that model to entrepreneurs that could build it into a product like Zillow, or something custom that would help a solar engineer kind of go to a house and quickly come up with an estimate. So it was a lot of focus on how do we take these tools that DOE had invested in and get them into the hands of the American business community that could then use them to deliver cool and innovative services to people.
More relating to your current position, you served as a senior advisor to the US CTO.
Right.
So how does that experience kind of bleed into your current role as the CTO of a department as large as the VA?
That's an interesting question. I think the role of the US CTO is pretty different than the role of a CTO at an agency, in the way that they have the CTO role established at the White House. The portfolio is pretty broad, but a lot of what the role is looking at how technology trends are going to impact the country as a whole, and what, if any, government response we need to those trends. So things like AI and its impact on jobs would be a topic that the US CTO's office might investigate. At a department, the role of the CTO is really to try to complement the IT teams and provide sort of technical leadership and technical vision on some of the top priorities. So I see the role being, especially in today's landscape in federal agencies, being a little bit more focused on implementation and trying to make sure that the agencies are adopting some of these current modern best practices in a way that is safe and scalable and effective.
So what are you currently working on? What's your top priority at VA right now? Yeah,
it's a great question. I wind up getting pulled in a lot of directions, but the past year, I spent a lot of time leading our digital modernization initiative, which resulted in the relaunch of the VA.gov homepage. And basically, our goal is to make VA have the best customer-facing experience of any agency in the federal government. And I think the VA.gov relaunch was a big milestone along that path. And I think a lot of my focus this year is going to be taking the lessons that we learned from the VA.gov project that our digital service team at VA has kind of pioneered at the VA, and try to scale those practices to more parts of VA. So we've made a couple of really exciting moves recently that are going to make it easier for the VA to adopt some of these modern concepts. Like DevOps is one of those words you'll hear a lot about, but basically trying to make teams more responsible for owning every aspect of a given service, both the development and the operation and the maintenance and the support, kind of all one team responsible for everything. We're going to try to roll that philosophy out to more projects at the VA using a more modern tool set and a more agile and user-centered style of delivering projects.
What are the greatest challenges you're finding with that initiative?
I think implementing anything new often requires changes to kind of three big categories of things: the people, the processes, and the tools. And so really across all three of those lanes, we need to make big improvements. But I think probably it starts with the people. We've got to find ways, I think, in government to empower people to do the right thing more easily. I think that's something that a lot of us became really struck by in the digital service, is just the quality of the people that work in the federal government is amazing. And oftentimes the missing ingredient is basically empowering somebody that knows what the right thing to do is. The missing ingredient is just letting them do it. And people will kind of, after so many years of working in the system, will kind of they'll get used to this idea that, the system is what it is and you have to just follow it, and that's all there is to it. And so finding ways to kind of break that mentality and make people kind of understand and realize that the system is just, was just made by people. And so it can be changed by people, but you just have to kind of empower people to do that. So that's one of the biggest challenges is taking our people and empowering them to do stuff faster and do the right thing. Because oftentimes the right thing is pretty obvious to everyone, but instead we just kind of do the standard thing because that's like the rules or something. Yeah. But if you ask someone, well, where does it say you have to do that? No one can really point you to where it says that. It's just kind of the way that we've always done it. So I think if we just followed common sense, we'd probably be a little bit better off in most categories of things.
It's so cool because we've interviewed a few people from USDS on GovCast in all departments, DHS, HHS, VA, and this philosophy seems to be a trend. So it's really cool to see the type of people that come into USDS kind of have a similar mindset when it comes to working on these citizen-facing services and modernization projects in government. It's a bit different, so it's refreshing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's to give an example, there's a really cool project that came out of the VA, our Loma Linda Medical Center. One of the administrators of that hospital in his spare time volunteers for the local search and rescue group. And for his search and rescue group, he had built on the side this little text message tool that would, when there was a search volunteers needed for a search, it would text every member of the search and rescue team. And when he got back to work, they were talking a lot about how missed appointments was this big problem that Loma Linda was facing. And it sort of occurred to him, that same thing that I built for my search and rescue group to get text messages out and see, who's available to come. We could just use that for the VA. We could text veterans and remind them when they have an appointment. They could even reply back and say, no, I can't make it, or yes, I can make it. And so he basically just did it. He got a small team together at Loma Linda and built this service that notified veterans proactively that they had an appointment upcoming. And that text message tool was effective at reducing missed appointments in Loma Linda pretty dramatically. It had a big impact. Other medical centers started hearing about it and asking if they could help them set it up. And so it spread sort of organically for a year or two. And then last year, we sort of heard about it at headquarters, and through a partnership with the health administration and my office, we helped scale that project nationwide. And so now, veterans receive a text message, appointment reminder. If they want to, they receive that text message, and that's been successful at reducing missed appointments. I think the latest numbers I saw was that it has reduced over 100,000 missed appointments since that went nationwide. And so that's a great example of, that wasn't like some brilliant idea that came out of somebody in Washington, right? That came from the field, and just a small group of people had the skills to put it together. Mm-hmm. And there's people like that all over the government. We just need to make them feel more empowered to do it.
Yeah, and I asked Marcy this because I think the VA is such an impactful organization. It really does. I mean, it's the largest healthcare organization in the country. So what has been the most rewarding part of your job at VA so far?
I think by far the thing that is awesome about working for the VA is the scale of the impact you can have. When you work on a product at the VA and it launches nationwide, that impacts millions of people. And so the text message, appointment reminder is a great example. Just the sheer scale of the sheer scale at which we operate gives you the chance to work on products that are going to touch a lot of people and touch them in a really impactful way. And compared to a lot of the stuff that I was working on in the tech industry, mm-hmm. Both the size of the impact and also the amount of the impact is not even comparable. I think back to I was spending a lot of time working on this live music discovery tool, which was like a cool idea, but at the end of the day, it didn't really matter, right? Mm-hmm. It helps people find a concert they might want to see. And I think if you look at Silicon Valley, there's a lot of work going into products like that, which are kind of cool consumer products that kind of help people that are already pretty well off have a slightly better life. They can more easily order a dog walker, which is awesome, and it helps the dog walker get a job or whatever. Mm-hmm. But I don't know. I feel like the country has a lot more important problems to work on than helping book dog walkers. And there's a lot of money going to problems like that right now, and a lot of talent. And that's why I think building avenues for people in the tech industry to come do public service really at any level is so important. That's one of the things I'm most proud about the digital service, is that I feel like we've started to try to build this tradition of public service in the tech industry, which is kind of unique among the professions in not having that tradition. Mm-hmm. If you think of the law or medicine or science, a lot of the most prestigious jobs in those fields involve federal government service in some way. Think of clerking for the Supreme Court is basically the most prestigious thing you can do out of law school. It's only for the best. There's no equivalent to that for a software engineer. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it's almost the opposite. If a software engineer spent a couple of years at the VA, I think until very recently, people would be like, well, that's kind of strange. I wonder if that person's any good, right? Mm-hmm. And that's crazy. So we need to change that. And we can change that on the government side by giving people with those skills the opportunity to come and have a really big impact. And also, I think we need to change on the tech side. People need to realize that public service is important, and that I think every good technologist should try to spend part of their career doing public service.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's crazy to think that, only years ago, roles like chief data officers, chief technology officers didn't exist. And now those are the people in government that are making the changes that citizens actually see. It's hard to see the changes that your government is making just for you. So if Yvette were to ask you, how are you working to make my life easier? How would you respond to that?
Well, probably the most visible thing is just the tools that VA is providing veterans to interact with the VA on va.gov are higher quality, more stable than in the past. And so we're trying to make it easier for people to interact with the VA online, mm-hmm. just like, somebody could interact with their bank or their insurance company sort of easily using website. We're trying to make the VA experience much more like that. Mm-hmm. But there's also a lot of work behind the scenes that are probably not going to be as visible to veterans. But, when they do submit a form to the VA, kind of what happens after that. There's also a lot of work that we're doing on that side of things that even if the impact is not quite as visible, the result is going to be faster services, more efficient services.
And I did want to ask you about your music app. So did you have an interest did you love to go see live music? Is that what kind of drove you to build an app like this? It's called Preamp.
Right? Yeah. So music has always been sort of a passion of mine. And it was just kind of an idea that a friend and I had come up with a few years ago in Boston, and sort of hacked on together for a little while, and then decided to kind of actually spend some time to build out the whole idea. And so I was sort of working on that actually when I got the call that I had received the innovation fellowship. So I had this nice. Kind of interesting dilemma, do I continue to work on this kind of cool product idea that I have, or should I take the fellowship? And I decided I couldn't pass up the fellowship. It was mm-hmm. such a unique opportunity. But it was a little bittersweet. I think the day before I started my fellowship or something like that, the TechCrunch covered Preamp and said it was awesome. And they were so excited about it. And I was like, oh man, well, but I'm really glad, in retrospect, I think it worked out pretty well.
So was it just two of you building the app?
Yeah, mostly me, and then some friends contributed here and there.
Is it the way you see in shows like Silicon Valley, where people are just sitting in a room with a bunch of computers and in your sweats and sneakers, and you're just coding away? I don't know.
Yeah, basically. We didn't have an office space or anything like that, so worked out of a co-working space, and a lot of just collaborating on chat and mm-hmm. Posting code on GitHub, and building. I think the experience of building stuff like that, really showed me that in the modern way of building software, it doesn't take a lot of people or money to create something. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the software the government builds is really not that complicated. Mm-hmm. Don't get me wrong, we do have really complicated software problems, like guided missiles and the space shuttle and things like that. But when we're talking about just like a database-backed web application, that's not a complicated problem. That's mm-hmm. a very solved problem in industry. We make it complicated by making all these crazy requirements and then hiring, missile defense companies to build database-backed web apps. Mm-hmm. I almost have this, I almost think that sometimes our projects fail because they're big. Like if you have 100 people all trying to work on one relatively simple piece of software, it's going to have to be complicated because there's no other way you can organize 100 people. Mm-hmm. But if you assigned like 10 people to try to do that same job, I think a lot of times you'd get a higher quality product at the end of it. So we're trying to implement some of those lessons at the VA. And
it's people who create these citizen consumer apps, like finding a dog walker, finding a concert near you, those practices that lead to the best practices in government to build these kinds of services. So people who come from industry and bring their knowledge and experience to government, that's so important. Because I was going to ask you, what government can learn from industry in terms of building citizen-facing web applications, redesigning websites, usability, user design. So it sounds like you brought lots of those practices with you.
One thing that often happens is this stuff gets bucketed in this category of innovation, and I really strongly react negatively to that. I think that in a lot of cases, we don't really need innovation to build web applications correctly. There's kind of like a new good way to build web applications, and it's pretty well understood. And we just need to follow those rules. Mm-hmm. It's not like we need to adopt some crazy new, AI blockchain set of technologies. Building a database-backed web app is pretty straightforward. So we just need to do it correctly.
And it's not innovative, right? Because I remember how I heard you speak at the Fed Health IT 100, and you talked about the difference between innovative and execution, innovation and execution. And building a website should be execution, but it's not necessarily innovative.
Exactly. And that's not to say we don't need innovation. Mm-hmm. There is a ton of actually great innovation happening today in the federal government. Literally the federal government is curing diseases and is building spaceships, right? So there is amazing innovation happening, but you don't need innovation to build a web application. That's actually, you need the opposite of that. You just need to take the current best practices that industry has kind of figured out. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these are open source, and they're very easy to implement. And we just need to get better at following that standard playbook. All
right. So now I wanted to ask a few questions about what you do outside of your time in government. Is music still a passion of yours, or any hobbies in DC that you've picked up since?
Yeah, well, we have a 2-year-old now, so we have less time for all sorts of hobbies, I would say. Sure. But yeah, I still really enjoy traveling. We brought our daughter to Paris this summer, and my wife and I really like traveling, so that's been really exciting. And then we also both really enjoy running and working out, mm-hmm. so doing a lot of that.
So self-health and travel are still possible when you have a child. Good to know.
It's possible.
So if you were to kind of summarize how your experiences at Harvard eventually led you to this path down industry, government, etc., how would you, in technology, from this interest in music and production, how would you summarize that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know that there is a big lesson there. I think mm-hmm. just being open to new experiences and kind of certainly I couldn't have predicted this path, but just kind of being open and going where opportunities take you mm-hmm. is really important. And I guess the other kind of really important lesson that I think I've learned is that when you find good bosses or good leaders, those are rare. So stick with them, mm-hmm. And then try to pay it forward, try to bring more people along. So I've been really lucky to work with people like Jen Palka and Todd Park and Nick Sinai and Mikey Dickerson and the whole crew. The people that we've worked with on this civic tech movement over the past 6 years are such incredible humans. And so that's been the best part of this journey. And so it's never felt like a good time to step away from it, mostly because the people are just so incredible. Mm-hmm. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about how do we get more people into this family and keep growing the civic tech movement.
So what's next for you? I don't want to say after VA. You're obviously still here. But do you think you'll continue to find ways, regardless of where your path takes you, to innovate government or citizen services, the nation, whether that's in government or industry?
There's this saying in digital service that we are sort of like impact junkies. And I think I have caught in that bug. So I think that I'm going to be continuing to look for opportunities to have a really big impact. I don't totally know all the different ways in which that could play out. But I think this whole experience has kind of taught me that there isn't some like secret group of people that have everything figured out and they're really in charge and we're just, working our jobs. There is no secret group of people. This is just a bunch of people trying their best. And that's probably true of literally everything in the world. So, I think, I'll be looking for opportunities to just be one of those people working on something really cool.
And any words of advice for students in school growing up right now with technology literally at their fingertips since birth to bring that expertise to the public service?
My advice is really more for the federal government to become better at hiring people like that, mm-hmm. Because we need to create pathways for people with those skills to start careers in public service and have that be a viable option. And right now, that's a really difficult challenge for a lot of people in that situation. So I think my best advice would be to go try to work in industry and kind of learn the skills, see how it works in the real world, and then look for opportunities to bring those to government.
Awesome.
I don't know, this is probably not super related, but there's a whole group of federal government contractors, And I would love to see the federal government contractor community do more rotations of their staff in and out of the federal practices. I think that the challenges the VA faces are more like, a hospital system or an insurance company than they are like the FDA or the IRS or things like that. So getting more rotation. A lot of these companies do work both with the big Fortune 500s and the big federal government, but the practices are so segregated. And I think over years, if you work in the federal government consulting practice, you just kind of learn that that's how it is in the federal government. Mm-hmm. And we don't get as much cross-pollination that way either. So I think getting people with skills in the private sector coming into public service is important. And also for the people that are doing contract work for the federal government, just rotating them across different types of companies so then they're not all just federal government only or public sector only, or private sector only could be helpful.
And everyone brings their own perspective. There's no way one person can know all of the struggles that veterans are having with the digital services that they provide. It's like countrywide. So how do you know how somebody in out west is struggling with their own VA medical services online? People from all over the country can have their own struggles, and if somebody from industry in a certain area knows those particular struggles well, they can bring those challenges in and try to fix them.
That's right. I think one of the most important tactics to making better government services really starts with understanding who the people are that use the services. I think play number one in the digital services playbook is understand what people need. And I think that design muscle is one of the actually most missing things in government. And it really pains me to see the industry kind of talking all about AI and blockchain and these new technologies while still people today are using systems that literally had never had a designer look at them. Mm-hmm. And we're talking now about using AI to automate them. It's crazy to me. Like if we just hired a couple designers and had them sit and look at just the way people are doing their jobs day in and day out and make a few tweaks, I'm convinced that would save way more money than any new tool that we're going to buy from the same vendors that got us into this mess.
So execute first and then innovate in this sense.
That's right. Yeah. And I'm not, we do need innovation. And I wish that actually, I think in a more well-functioning government, the role of the CTO would be all about that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. But right now the role is, bring us up to today's standard.
Right. Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Me. That was a great interview with Charles. I think he touched on some really valuable points, like how they set up USDS and all of that in the early stages.
Yeah, I think it's so cool what he said about USDSers being impact junkies. Based on our previous GovCast episodes in season 1 with members of USDS from VA, DHS, HHS, I think it really perfectly describes the mentality and mindset that this team brings to government. I also think he brought up really good points about hiring and the workforce in government.
Exactly. Like when he mentioned you need to empower your workforce before you can even innovate anything. I thought that was a really valuable point that I think a lot of people sometimes forget in this day and age of, AI and bots and all those magic words that we hear all the time.
Yeah, and I think government already has a hard enough time retaining talent, considering they can't compete with the salaries that industry is able to provide for IT talent specifically. So what he said about making sure to follow up with applicants and making them feel like their resume just didn't go into a black hole and disappear, following up and letting them know the process might take longer might help to keep them interested and not get discouraged from applying to government. It's also important to know about the new va.gov, something that Charles and his team worked on. And we also covered in season 1 of GovCast with Marcy Jacobs, who's with the digital service team at VA. The new site's backend is planned to be almost like a portfolio or a platform for vets so they can see their medical appointments and benefits and documents, almost a feature that consumers demand because they're used to that in their apps and websites today. So that's really important to note. I hope that evolves and users start to really benefit from those services.
It's the perfect example of the idea that you don't need to come from a government background in order to do really cool things in government.
GovCast is a production of Government CIO Media and Research. It's produced and edited by Amy Kluber. Our theme music is provided by Big Hoax. Our executive producer is Michael Hoffman. If you're interested in sponsoring GovCast, you can email Joseph O'Neill at JONEILL@governmentcio.com.